Once upon a time, there was a cute little Hoya cutting that showed up in the plant room. It was a thank you gift that came along with an order I had recently placed, and I was thrilled to have it. I didn't know anything about it, but I could root a Hoya, so I settled it in and gave it some food and some light and some time, and it turned into a monster. So, with a tasty beverage close to hand, join me this week's end while we take a look at plants that grew a little bit more than I expected them to. And this is that plant. This is Hoya AH-014, and it showed up as a single leaf, one node cutting, about that big. And it didn't do much for a little while. And finally it settled in and it started pushing out vines like this. Thick, heavy vines. And it grew and it grew. And I had to up-pot it. And it kept on growing. Apparently it liked what I was doing. So it's turned into this. It's not quite massive, but it's a good-sized plant. Far more than I expected. And it just keeps growing. I've taken cuttings from it, and because it grew too large for the space I had, and so it responded by putting out another vine. I took cuttings a few months ago to try and sell, and I couldn't even give them away. No one was interested because it's not splashy and it's not interesting enough. But it grows like a weed. And I finally had to move it off the plant shelf because it's just too tall. And it now stands on the floor near the plant shelf. So it still gets some decent light, but it just keeps on growing. It hasn't bloomed for me yet. It hasn't yet put out a peduncle. I'm curious to see that, but I don't know how much taller. I mean, it'll keep going as long as I give it more space. I'm debating whether or not to add an addition to this trellis, because now that it's on the floor, it could go for another 2 or 3 feet. My problem starts to become one of architecture. This trellis, while sturdy, is starting to become top heavy, which was one of the initial problems I had when I had to move it off the plant shelf. So I'm going to have to figure out a way to stabilize, that's the word, this trellis, and maybe we'll see how much further this will go. It's a really pretty plant. It's got a little bit of splash on the leaves. They're thick, they're dark green, and man, if you need a plant that's going to take over, this is the one. This is Hoya AH-014. Many years ago when I started my Hoya journey, one of the first Hoyas I really wanted was Hoya obovata. I loved those big green round leaves. Every example I saw of the plant online was really, really interesting. And I thought, I want one of those. So I ordered a cutting, and it was a small cutting. And for a long time, I could not figure out why my plant wouldn't grow for me. It was not at all happy. I wasn't giving it what it wanted. And it just kind of sat there and stared at me from the bottom of the plant shelf. When I got a little bit more experience with Hoyas, I understood that it wanted more food, it wanted more water, and it wanted more light. And so it responded by doing this. This is, I think, a really, really beautiful plant. It's put out some peduncles. It's growing like crazy. There's peduncle over here as well. The leaves are just beautiful. Under the lights, the splash gets a little bit of a purple color to it, a little pink color, which is very, very pretty. And it's just doing really well. I'm very happy with this plant, very satisfied. I wish I'd figured it out a little bit sooner, but you know, that's how it goes. So, let's say there, it'll wedge its leaves in anywhere, and which is why you get some of these funky shapes from time to time. But on the whole, it's a really, really pretty plant. It wants, I keep saying it, it wanted more light than I was giving it. It wanted more water than I was giving it. And it wanted more food than I was giving it. And when I finally gave it what it wanted, it responded with this. So this is a good grower. It's turned into far more than I anticipated, but we're okay with that. This is Hoya obovata. We're taking a little break from the Hoyas right now because there are other plants in my collection. I had seen pictures of jewel orchids for years, but I had no experience growing them. I can grow Phalaenopsis orchids like nobody's business. They rebloom for me. They do great. We get along fine. In one of my earlier videos, you saw my Zygopetalum orchid who lives over there. But I tried some jewel orchids. I came across a little pot of them, like a 4-inch pot, a little over a year ago at a local nursery. And the price was good, and I thought, all right, let's give this a try. They were pretty. They had just started to bloom when I brought that first pot home. The leaves on this one are fairly simple. There are some jewel orchids that have more intricate patterns on the leaves. The blossoms are not anything fancy. They're absolutely beautiful, but they're tiny. They grow on spikes that'll rise up about this far. This one hasn't bloomed yet. By the way, this is Ludisia discolor, and it's the black variety. And so I watched Miss Orchid Girl, and she talked about taking her little pot of Ludisia discolor and putting it into a larger, shallower bowl. And hers grew very well, and so did mine. This is a very easy plant. It lives in my conditions, it lives in ambient temperature, ambient humidity. They are what I would refer to as leaf litter plants. So they're not true epiphytes the way that Phalaenopsis and the other orchids that we're more familiar with, perhaps. These live in the leaf litter on the forest floor. So I tried to make a mix that was sort of aeroidy. I mean, it was chunky, but it has some sphagnum in it. It has some bark. It has a little bit of stuff, but it also has some coco coir and some pumice. So it drains, but it holds a little bit of moisture. As I said, this lives in ambient temperature. It's not under any special grow lights. Clearly, it's not under any kind of dome or in a cabinet. It gets some early morning sun. And the interesting thing about it is it spreads out rather horizontally. It arcs a little bit, and when it reaches the ground or touches the ground, then it starts to grow up, which may be the signal for it to start blooming. It hasn't yet. I'm really looking forward to it. But if you can find a nice little pot of Ludisia discolor black, in very little time, you're going to end up with something that looks like this. I can highly recommend this. This has been so much fun and very, very satisfying. And again, far more than I thought it was going to turn into. Ludisia discolor black. And now back to the Hoyas. This little fellow is Hoya curtisii. Again, I had seen pictures of it online, but I never saw any samples for sale, whether through a traditional larger online nursery or through a smaller seller. And I was up in Massachusetts at a different store and drove past a Home Depot and had a premonition that I should go in. So we pulled in. I went in, and there were two small pots of Hoya curtisii. I thought about getting both of them, but I decided to leave one of them for somebody else. So I grabbed it by the hanger and lifted it up, and no Hoya should weigh that much. The finger went in, it was grossly overwatered. That thing was not going to dry out anytime soon. But it was coming home with me. There were no two ways about that. So when I got it home, I left it in its pot for a while, but I slipped a piece of plastic in along the outside edge of the pot, pulled it forward, and put in a folded up paper towel. And I did that at 3 or 4 spots around the outside edge to try and wick out some of the moisture from the soil. I knew I couldn't leave it in that cloppy mix. It was just not going to survive. So I gave it a couple days to dry out. I kept switching out the paper towels, trying to pull out as much moisture from that soil as I could. And then settled down, spread out a little plastic tarp, and opened up the pot. And what I ended up with were 3 or 4 clumps of Hoya curtisii. And I mixed up a batch of bark and sphagnum with a little bit of cocoa coir and planted those plugs in a net pot. So it's in a pot like this inside this cover pot, and settled him in there. And once I got the lighting right, he wants more light than, it's my same old story with Hoyas. He wants more light than I originally thought. He wants more food than I originally thought. But the water is where it's a little different. He likes the light, he likes the food, but I water him lightly. I water him lightly once a week. So because he's in bark sphagnum mix in a net pot, that will all flush through that substrate and drain out into the bottom of this cover pot. So he gets lightly watered once a week, and he's been doing really, really well. He's been liking the food lately, and now that the warmer temperatures have come, although it's always pretty good here in the plant room, there's all kinds of new growth. The leaves are just beautiful. It's almost camouflage leaves. They're this beautiful little kind of squat, fat heart shape, and the vines just keep going. I've seen bigger ones, longer ones, and mine will get there. He's a bit of a slow grower, but he's a steady grower and has produced this beautiful, lush plant for me. So keep your eyes open. I found him in a big box store, so they're out there. It's from that plant company. And keep your eyes open. They don't show up too often, at least where I live, but they're there and they're available and they're reasonably priced. So keep your eye open for Hoya curtisii. And the last Hoya on the list for today is this Hoya meredithii. I knew that it got big leaves when I ordered it. Big is a relative term. I was thinking big leaves. I was not thinking big leaves. The leaves are absolutely beautiful. This one, it's all about the foliage. They're just, I can just sit and look at this plant sometimes. People come and visit, and when they're in the plant room, I get, oh, what is that? That's a Hoya meredithii. It's been doing really well. It tends to put out, in my case, it tends to put out long vine leaf. These are the two closest to each other in terms of internodal spacing. But it's also put out another vine, which it hasn't produced anything yet, but it found the trellis. I don't even want to think about retrellising this. It found the trellis and it's growing like crazy, which is really cool. Happy. It sometimes seems a little sensitive. If I mess with the vine too much, it'll just stop. When I first got it, it was, I think, this leaf. It was a single node cutting. So everything else from here on up is all new. And it seemed that every time I messed with the vine, it would just like, oh, no, we don't like that. We're going to pout for a little bit. And once I light, moisture, food, and kind of left it alone, it did fine. What are there? 2, 4, 5, 6, there's 8 leaves, and I'm happy with that. If there were 20 leaves, that would be very cool. But there's 8 leaves and we're good to go. 20 leaves, I don't know. I had to move it off the plant shelves. He's beside the plant shelves now, not behind. So he still gets the fallout, but he's too tall for that. And my plant shelves are about, well, probably 3 feet. It's a 6-foot shelf and there's one shelf in the middle. So he doesn't clear the lights anymore. So he needs to be on the side. Yay. He can do pretty much whatever he wants to. This is beautiful. I will make arrangements for him, whatever he decides to do. It would be very cool if that other vine decided to start putting out leaves. Again, I've got something of an architecture issue here. I think I'm going to have to, I'm hesitant to do this. Let's see okay, there's some roots coming through. I may need to up-pot this to give the base, put it in a larger pot so that there's more weight down here. And I may need to make one of my standard trellises. This was a get by. This plant needs a tall trellis really quick. So it's made with the end of a roll of PVC coated garden fence. And it's not a really strong, stable trellis for it. But I don't want to mess with it because those are like cardboard. They're like thick plastic. They look all nice and pretty, but they're rigid. So I'm going to have to figure out a situation for this. I'm not really looking forward to repotting and retrellising it, but maybe someday I'll make another cocktail and just dedicate a couple hours to redoing it. It's a beautiful plant. If you can find one of these and you've got some space for it, then I'd highly, highly suggest it. This is Hoya meredithii. So that's all for this week's End video. I want to thank you for joining me, for spending the time and visiting. Join me here next week with a tasty beverage close to hand. whether that's one that comes in a glass shaped like this, or whether it's one that comes in a mug. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and thanks for watching.